The memo sat on the boardroom table, still warm from the printer, and every director in the room had already decided who put it there. 2 years ago, Bisi had walked into this building in a borrowed blouse, holding a CV a security guard almost refused to let through the gate. Now she stood at the far end of a table she had earned the right to sit at, while 12 pairs of aespa weighed whether to take it back. One of the directors, who had praised her work in front of the whole finance team only a month earlier, now studied her the way people study a stain they are trying to place. Namdi kept his eyes on a scratch in the wood grain instead of on her face, because looking at her would have meant deciding something he was not ready to decide. That the woman who had once cooked for his mother when nobody else would might also be the woman who had just tried to rob him. Bisi did not break. She had learned, in a hut with no running water, that the worst rooms in the world rarely announce themselves. They arrive holding a piece of paper. 3 floors below that boardroom, inside a drawer nobody had opened in months, a single sheet of paper was waiting to undo every certainty the room was holding onto. If people you trusted have ever decided you were guilty before you said a word, stay with this story to the end and tell me your city in the comments. Dear friends, watching tonight, you already know I want your city in the comments. But before we go any further, take a second to like this video too and subscribe to the channel if stories like Stolz Bzizis are the kind you want more of. It genuinely helps us keep telling them. Now, let's begin. The story really starts on a Tuesday morning in January the 9th, to be specific, in a market that had no official name, only a long strip of wooden stalls along the main road of Umuchukwu village, in a corner of Anambra State where the tarred road ended and the red earth took over. Bisi had been in Umuchukwu for 11 days by then. She had arrived from Lagos on the overnight bus with 2 bags, a NYSC posting letter, and a phone that kept searching for a network signal it never quite found. The National Youth Service Corps had assigned her to a secondary school at the edge of the village. 32. Students split across 2 classrooms, one of which had a ceiling that let in enough rain to make Mondays interesting. Her monthly allowance was 19,800 naira. Her rent was 12,000. What remained fed her, bought chalk, and paid for the Okita rides to school. On days, the path flooded. She had not complained, not to anyone in Lagos, not to the other corpers stationed in the local government area, not even in the voice memos she recorded for herself late at night when the generator in the compound cut out and left her in full dark. There is a particular kind of discipline that belongs to people who have already lost something they cannot replace. The discipline of treating today exactly as what it is, not what it feels like. Bisi had learned this earlier than most. The first week she spent getting the measure of the place. Umuchukwu was not a poor village in the way that poverty is usually imagined from the outside. Not desperate, not static. It was a working village that had been working long before anyone arrived to document it. The market ran 3 mornings a week. The church at the center of the main road held 3 services on Sundays, the last one overflowing into the yard. There was a cooperative that produced palm oil, a women's craft guild that sold to buyers from Onitsha, and a savings network that Bisi recognized immediately as an Ajo arrangement, though it was running informally, by memory rather than ledger, in a way that meant the members trusted each other completely and verified nothing. The school where she taught occupied a compound of 4 classrooms and 1 administration block with a broken padlock on the office door. Her first class, Basic Commerce, Junior Secondary 2, had 21 students who looked at her with the careful evaluation that children apply to adults they have not yet decided to respect. She gave them a problem on her first morning. A market vendor buys tomatoes for 30 naira a basket and sells them for 45. What is the profit margin? They worked it out on slate boards. 3 of them finished before she had finished writing the question. She decided on the walk home that afternoon that this posting would not be wasted. The NYSC corporate house was at the edge of the main compound. 3 rooms. A shared kitchen with a two-burner gas stove that had one working burner. A bathroom with cold water that ran at pressure only in the early morning. Bisi woke at 5:15 each day. She boiled water on the working burner for her bath, ate whatever she had bought the day before, and walked the 14-minute path to school because the Okada cost she could not always justify. On the mornings it rained, she paid the Okada fare and recorded it in her notebook without guilt, because she had already decided which things were worth the expenditure, and transport in rain was one of them. The kerosene vendor's name was Chukwudi. He was a short man who operated from beneath a faded blue canopy at the north end of the market, and he had been overcharging customers for so long that the overcharge had quietly become the price. Most people did not check, or almost no one did. Bisi was buying tomatoes from the stall beside his when she heard the old woman's voice. Not raised, not angry, just the particular quiet of a person who has been making do on too little for too many years to bother with volume. You are telling me 950? Yes, ma, 950 per liter. Market price, ma. Last week it was 600. Last week is gone, ma. Fuel cost go up. Everything go up. You know how be. Bisi looked over. The old woman was perhaps 70, dressed in a faded Ankara wrapper with a small kerosene keg in both hands, holding it the way you hold something you have walked a long way to fill. She had the kind of face that had been beautiful once and had not entirely stopped being so. High cheekbones, a forehead marked with 2 small tribal lines, eyes that were still working hard on the vendor's face. Her name, Bisi would learn later, was Chinwe. Everyone in Umuchukwu called her Mama Chinwe. What Chukwudi was actually charging her, Bisi worked out in about 4 seconds, was 1,550 naira per liter, not 950. The small handwritten sign behind him said 950, but the figures he was writing on his pad did not match the sign. He was adding 600 naira per liter into his margin, counting on the fact that most of his customers did the arithmetic in their heads and not on paper. Bisi had been trained as an auditor. She could not help it. "Excuse me," she said. Chakudi looked at her with the impatience of a man interrupted in the middle of a transaction going exactly his way. "Unti, I am attending to a customer. I know. I counted." She pointed at the pad. "You wrote 12 liters at 1,550. That is 18,600 naira. But your sign says 950. 12 liters at 950 is 11,400. You are charging her 7,200 extra." The market did not exactly go quiet, but it shifted. The tomato seller stopped sorting tomatoes. 2 men at the adjacent stall became very interested in what was happening. Chukwudi's jaw moved without producing a sound, which was its own kind of answer. Mama Chinwe looked at Bisi with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to trust an umbrella during a downpour. "A beg, auntie, you no work here," Chukwudi said. "This is between me and my customer, and I am a bystander who can read. Either you correct the total, or I will walk to the local government office this afternoon. They have a consumer protection desk. I have the address." She did not have the address. She had a class in 38 minutes. But Chukudi did not know either of those things, and the phrase local government office did something to him that logic alone had not. He corrected the total. He did it slowly, with the energy of a man swallowing something that tasted entirely wrong, and he counted out 11,400 naira onto the counter. Mama Chinwe counted it twice. Then she looked at Bisi. "My daughter," she said, in a voice so quiet Bisi almost missed it. "Who are you?" They walked together to the main road when the transaction was done. Mama Chinwe moved slowly, favoring her left side in a way that suggested her hip had been causing trouble long enough that she had stopped expecting it to stop. Bisi carried the kerosene keg without being asked. The old woman did not protest this, which meant she was either too proud or too tired to fight small battles, and she did not strike Bisi as a woman who wasted energy on the wrong ones. They talked for 12 minutes by the roadside. Mama Chinwe told her she lived alone in a compound at the south end of the village. Her husband, Emmanuel, had died 9 years earlier, February the 11th, 2014, and the compound had been getting quieter ever since. She had a son. He was in Port Harcourt. She mentioned this the way people mention a city that is far away from everything that matters. He sends money, she said, but you cannot eat wire transfer, my daughter. Bisi laughed at that. Not the polite laugh she used with strangers, but the kind that catches you while you are mid-breath. Mama Chinwe noticed the difference. She was the type of woman who noticed things. Before they parted, Bisi told her she lived in the compound by the water pump, the third room on the left. She taught at the secondary school. She was free on Tuesday and Saturday evenings. If Mama Chinwe ever needed anything carried, she should send word. She was not entirely sure she meant it as an open-ended offer, but she meant it as more than a pleasantry. There is a category of a person you meet in a market who changes the shape of the rest of your month, and sometimes the rest of your year, and you sense it within the first few minutes, even if you cannot explain why. Mama Chinwe sent word the following Saturday. That same Saturday morning, Bisi ran her Ajo cooperative in the schoolyard. 23 women, 5,000 naira monthly contribution each. The pool rotated. One woman received the full payout of 115,000 naira each month. Her turn in the cycle that moved around the group over the course of nearly 2 years. No bank, no intermediary, no form to fill. Just a ledger Bisi kept in her second bag, a pen, and the kind of trust that functions because everyone inside it can see everyone else's face every week. She had started it 3 weeks after arriving, when she noticed that several women in the compound lost money every dry season to informal moneylenders who charged weekly interest they could not sustain. The Ajo was not revolutionary. It was older than any of the women could remember. It just needed someone willing to run it, who would not run off with the contributions when the balance grew large enough to be tempting. The women came in ones and twos from 7 o'clock onwards, sitting on the low school wall and on the bench outside the classroom door. Mama Titi, who sold groundnut oil, Mrs. Adaora, who ran the stationery shop near the church junction, Ngozi the tailor, who could not be called Ngozi without the qualifier because there were 4 Ngozis in the cooperative. Bisi read the names from the ledger, marked each contribution, and by 8:30 the session was done, and a woman named Veronica was going home with 115,000 naira in an envelope that she held against her chest the entire walk. Word about the Ajo had spread the way things spread in small places, along laundry lines and beside boreholes, through the quiet, efficient network of women who are always the last to be consulted and the first to be needed. That was partly why, by November, Mama Chinwe had started calling her my child instead of my daughter. The difference was small and enormous at the same time. By the end of February, Bisi had a routine that fit Umuchukwu like a worn wrapper, loose enough to move in, shaped to her body. Monday through Friday, she taught English language and basic commerce at the secondary school. She gave the students her number for questions because there was no textbook budget, and she refused to make them suffer for a funding problem that was not theirs. On Thursdays, she stayed late to help 6 students preparing for their West African Examinations Council papers. Good students, focused in the way that students become focused when they have no backup plan and are carrying the weight of a family's entire bet. Tuesdays and Saturdays, she went to Mama Chinwe. Some evenings it was cooking. Jollof rice on a kerosene stove, or igusi soup with the stockfish that Mama Chinwe soaked overnight, or just boiled yam with red palm oil on the nights when the market had been expensive. Some evenings it was carrying water from the pump 2 streets over, because the old woman's right knee had started locking in cold weather, and the walk was longer than it looked from inside the compound. Some evenings it was nothing practical at all. They would sit in the 2 chairs outside the doorway where the light went long and orange over the tin rooftops, and Mama Chinwe would talk, and Bisi would listen. Mama Chinwe talked about Emmanuel the way a person talks about a place they have loved and cannot return to, with specificity, with no bitterness, with the measured care of someone who has decided that the love is worth the cost of carrying it. Emmanuel Okafor had been a secondary school mathematics teacher. He had taught in a school 40 kilometers away for 31 years without taking a transfer. He used to wake before sunrise to grade papers, drinking black tea because the milk money had usually already been spent by the end of the month. He had died of a cardiac event on the morning of February the 11th, 2014, at the age of 63, sitting in the same chair that now stood outside the compound door beside Bisi. Mama Chinwe had not moved the chair. She had not even considered moving it. Emmanuel was not a man who showed love with gifts, she said once. On a Saturday evening in March, when the sky was doing its best work above Umuchukwu and neither of them was in a hurry to go inside. He showed it by being there. Every morning when I woke up, he was already at his table with his papers and his tea. For 34 years. Then one morning I woke up and the tea was still there, still warm, and he was not. She was quiet for a moment. The hardest thing about losing someone like that is that you keep expecting them in all the ordinary places. Bisi said nothing. There was nothing to add. She just sat with the weight of it, which was, she was learning, sometimes the most necessary thing a person could offer another. On one of the Tuesday evenings in early April, Bisi arrived to find Mama Chinwe sitting outside the compound with a small Bible open on her knee, and the particular quality of stillness that means a person has been sitting in one place long enough to stop noticing they are sitting. She did not immediately stand when Bisi came through the gate. She looked up and then looked back at the Bible, and Bisi sat on the bench beside her and said nothing, because there are states of a person that should not be interrupted with helpfulness. After several minutes, Mama Chinwe closed the Bible. February is always difficult, she said. Even when it has passed, it leaves a residue. I know, Bisi said. The morning Emmanuel died, I had made his tea. The same as every morning. He always took 1 spoon of sugar and a little more than I thought was necessary. He used to say that sweetness is a decision, not an accident. She smoothed the cover of the Bible with one palm. He was at his table when I came outside. I called him for the tea. He did not answer. When I looked properly, I saw that he was very still. He was sitting exactly as a man sits when he is resting deeply, except that his rest was done. She said this without drama. That was the thing about Mama Chinwe. She delivered the most devastating sentences in a register that belonged to ordinary conversation, as if she had learned long ago that grief does not require an elevated voice. I sat beside him for a while before I called anyone, she said. I did not want the world to come in before I had finished saying goodbye. Bisi looked at the chair beside the doorway. She had sat in that chair on 20 or 30 evenings by now, near enough to touch it with her foot. She had never once thought about what it was holding. I'm glad you stayed with him, she said. Mama Chinwe looked at her for a long moment. Huh? Then she said simply yes. He would have waited for me. She had one son, Namdi. Mama Chinwe spoke his name differently from all other names. A half-second of care before it, like a musician positioning a note before striking it. He was in Port Harcourt. He ran a petroleum business. She mentioned this the way someone mentions weather, as information, not as biography. Because the size of the business was not the part that mattered to her. He built me a big house, she said, one evening in April, over by the church. 14 rooms, my daughter. Generator, borehole, Italian tiles on every floor. You should see it. Have you stayed there? Mama Chin looked at the wall of the compound, the old cement wall cracked in 2 places, painted blue once and now simply weathered. Once, she said. This compound is where Emmanuel died. His smell is still in the walls. I know that sounds like madness, but it is the truth. I cannot explain that to Nanamdi in a way he understands because Nanamdi is a practical man. He cannot understand why I would choose a place with holes in the roof over a place with tiles on the floor. I think I understand, Bisi said. The old woman looked at her for a moment directly, the way she rarely looked at people directly. Yes, she said quietly, I think you do. It was 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, that Bisi first stood outside the house by the church. 14 rooms had been an abstraction. The structure in front of her was not. The gate was wrought iron, properly sealed and repainted so that no rust had found a way in. The main building was cream with dark green shutters. A borehole pump stood in the left corner of the yard, inside a tiled alcove. A standby generator, large enough, she estimated, to run a small hotel, sat under a corrugated shade to the right. The compound was clean because a groundskeeper visited on Tuesdays and Fridays, a fact Mama Chinwe mentioned with a tone that suggested she found it mildly embarrassing, though she had not asked for it to be stopped. They had come to clean it before Nanamdi's next visit. This was something Mama Chinwe did regardless of whether the groundskeeper had already been. She cleaned her son's rooms herself when he was coming home, because some acts of care are about the doing and not the result. Bisi helped her dust and mop. She wiped the mirrors in 3 of the rooms and replaced the lamp mantles in the parlor and swept the veranda twice, because the harmattan had left a thin white powder on everything within the past 48 hours. She asked no questions about what Namdi did in Port Harcourt. Mama Chinwe offered no details beyond petroleum business. It was one of the qualities of women who have worked hard all their lives that they describe enormous wealth without adjectives, the same way they describe their own labor as simply what is. Namdi Okafor arrived the following weekend, on a Friday afternoon in early May, in a convoy of 3 vehicles that caused children to stop playing in the road. 2 black Toyota Land Cruisers and 1 white Mercedes G-Class. The G-Class was his. Bisi saw them from Mama Chinwe's window and thought, this man is not a junior engineer. She met him for the first time the following morning. Mama Chinwe had apparently told him about her at length and in more detail than Bisi had expected. He came to the compound door alone, a tall man of 41 with his father's cheekbones and the particular stillness that develops in people who have spent many years making decisions that cost significant amounts of money. He thanked her for what she had been doing for his mother. He thanked her specifically. Cooking, water, the Ajo group Mama Chinwe had told him about, the kerosene vendor incident at the market. He thanked her formally and without excess. Bisi said it had not been a burden, which was true. He evaluated this response for a moment longer than she expected, the way someone runs a check on a calculation before accepting it. Kemi came out from behind him. Kemi Adeyemi was 34, dressed in a linen set that had not been bought in Nigeria. The particular cream of fabric that has been laundered so many times in the right machines that it holds its color without yellowing. She wore her nails at a length that required professional maintenance, white tips, filed square, each one finished with a precision that took time. She was engaged to Nanamdi. She was, Bisi would discover, the group finance director of Okonkwo Petroleum Group. She shook Bisi's hand with 2 fingers and a smile that did not travel above her cheekbones, and said, lovely to meet you, in the tone of someone who has met enough people to know that loveliness is a standard she is not responsible for maintaining. Mama Chinwe served them lunch at the compound that afternoon. She had cooked that morning. Oaf onugbu, the bitter leaf soup with stockfish and dried crayfish that she made the way her own mother had taught her, 3 hours on the fire without shortcuts, the kind of soup that takes patience and rewards it. Kemi sat at the table, looked at the pot, and asked, with a small smile, whether there was perhaps a lighter option available. I don't eat heavy sauces, she said. They expand in the stomach. Mama Chinwe looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then she went inside without a word and came back with a boiled egg and 2 slices of bread she had not planned to serve. She set them down in front of Kemi, turned to serve her son, and did not address the matter again. Nanamdi had the grace to eat 3 platettes of oaf onugbu. What happened after lunch was the moment that settled into Bisi's memory most permanently, not because it was loud, but because it was so entirely quiet. Nanamdi had stepped outside to take a call. Kemi was walking through the sitting room, moving between the dining table and the window, when she caught her elbow on the sideboard and knocked Emmanuel's photograph to the floor. The frame hit the cement, and the glass cracked. A diagonal split, corner to corner, across the face of a man in his retirement suit, smiling at a camera on the best professional day of his life. Kemi looked at it for a moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, "That's all right. We'll have a new one made, a proper digital print with better resolution." Honestly, these old photographs lose color so badly, you can barely see the person anyway. She stepped around it. She kept walking. Mama Chinwe was in the doorway. She had seen all of it. She stood very still for 4 seconds, holding a dish towel, and then she walked to the fallen photograph and picked it up with both hands, the way you pick up a bird that has dropped from a height, and you cannot yet tell what is broken. She did not say a word to Kemi. She turned to Bisi, who had also seen, and their eyes held for less than 2 seconds. That was the entire conversation. That was all it needed to be. Later, while Nanamdi was saying goodbye at the gate and Kemi was examining her phone in the front seat of the G class, Mama Chinwe took Bisi's hand. "My son needs a woman who knows the difference between what is valuable and what is expensive," she said. Bisi said nothing. It was not the kind of sentence that was inviting a response. The Sunday before Bisi left Umuchukwu, the last Sunday of her service year, in July, Nanamdi was parked outside her school when she came out of the gate with her discharge papers. He was alone in the G class wearing a white caftan, looking less like the owner of a petroleum group, and more like a man who had a specific place to be and had made a choice to be here first. He had done his research. He had called her NYSC area coordinator. He had spoken to her school principal. He had seen the Ajo Cooperative's ledger, which Mama Chinwe had shown him without informing Bisi she planned to. "You ran a rotating savings pool of over 1,380,000 naira for 23 women on a handshake," he said. "No default, no dispute, no shortfall. 1,380,000 naira total over 6 months. Bisi said, because she was not going to discuss her own record precisely. 23 participants, 100% on-time contribution rate. 1 month we had a late arrival of 3 days from one participant due to a medical emergency, which was accounted for in the ledger with a written note and the group's verbal approval." Namdi was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who are not filling silence with noise while they think. Then he said, "Our internal audit department has an opening. Entry-level analyst. 280,000 naira a month, plus a housing supplement of 45,000 for non-Port Harcourt residents. Can you start the 15th of September?" She said yes, the way a person says yes when the right door opens at the right time, without drama and without pretending it is anything less than what it is. Port Harcourt was a different weather system entirely. Not just the coastal heat which landed on you at the top of the airport exit ramp like a cloth soaked in warm water, but the density of the city, the layered simultaneous noise of a place that had been arguing with itself pleasantly for decades. Bisi arrived on the 12th of September, 3 days early, because she was not going to be the person who arrived on the 15th having miscalculated what the Lagos traffic would do to a cross-country departure. She rented a room in a compound in GRA Phase 2, 85,000 naira a month, small and clean, with running water from 6 to 9 in the morning and 6 to 8 in the evening, which was dependable enough to plan around. The flat was 4 kilometers from OPG's head office on Transamadi Road, a commute she could manage by KK Napep in under 25 minutes if she left before 7. On her first evening in Port Harcourt, she sat on the bed and divided her monthly salary into 7 envelopes: rent, food, transport, savings, a monthly contribution to Mama Chinway's market money contingency, and one she labeled in pencil mistakes, because a new city and a new role would produce them, and it was more honest to budget for error than to pretend you were beyond it. She had prepared for the job the way she prepared for everything, not by performing readiness, but by actually becoming ready. She knew that Okonkwo Petroleum Group had been founded by Emmanuel Okafor in 1998 with a single fuel distribution license and a truck he had financed through a cooperative loan. She knew that Nnamdi had taken the company over in 2009 at 30 years old and expanded its operations across 4 states: Rivers, Delta, Bayelsa, and Edo, managing pipeline contracts, distribution terminals, and midstream processing. She knew the most recently published revenue figure from a trade industry publication was 4,200,000,000 naira for the prior fiscal year. She did not know what it felt like to work for a company that generated that number. She would find out. The internal audit department occupied the third floor of OPG's head office. 11 staff, 3 senior analysts, 5 junior analysts, 2 administrative officers, and the head of department, Mr. Patrick Eze, who had the energy of a man who had survived several audits of organizations that would have preferred not to be audited and had found the experience professionally formative. He reviewed Bisi's CV for 45 seconds on her first morning, tapped it twice with one finger, and said, "Your AJO accounts are cleaner than most of the companies I have examined professionally. Try not to embarrass that record." It was in the compressed professional register of Port Harcourt, high praise. Kemi Ademi's office was on the 6th floor, group finance. In a building of 6 floors, this detail was not incident. 6th floor people and 3rd floor people shared lifts as a reminder of the distance between them, which is different from sharing them as a practical matter of vertical movement. Bisi went to the 6th floor only when a file needed hand delivery, which happened 4 times in her first 2 months. Twice for quarterly variance reports, once for a procurement cost summary, once for a supporting schedule that Mr. Ease described as something group finance was asking for gently, which means they need it urgently, which means yesterday. Each time she encountered Kemi. The first time, Kemi looked through her the way you look through glass when the glass has no reflection. The second time, in a hallway with 2 other finance staff within clear earshot, she said, "Oh, this is the girl Mama found in the village." Namdi mentioned something about an Ajo savings group, women with kerosene money and tin cups. How wonderfully community-minded of her. She smiled at the 2 colleagues in a way that shared the joke without completing it, and walked past without waiting for a response. Bisi handed over the file. "Good afternoon, Ma," she said, and went back to the lift. She did not tell Mr. Ease. She did not mention it to Namdi. The incidents accumulated the way water accumulates behind a dam. Steadily, without announcing themselves, and with the particular patience of things that are in no hurry because they have all the time they need. The third encounter happened at a company networking event in October, a quarterly drinks gathering held in the OPG reception atrium that the communications team called the Forum, and that most of the staff called the Hour, where we stand with small plates and make conversation about the industry. Bisi was there because Mr. Ease had told the entire department they were expected to attend. She was standing near the pillar by the window, holding a glass of tonic water, when Kemi arrived with 2 group finance colleagues and stopped within 3 meters of her. Kemi looked at her. Then she looked at the glass of tonic water. Then she looked at Bisi's blazer, the one blazer Bisi owned, purchased secondhand from a market in Lagos for 3,500 naira, well pressed and fitted, but carrying, to an experienced eye, slight asymmetry in the lapels that marks a garment that began life with someone else. "My dear," Kemi said, loud enough for the two colleagues beside her. Are you aware that these events have a dress standard? I know Nanamdi means well by opening the floor to the whole building, but there is something uncomfortable about staff from the analytics levels treating this like a village end of year party. It creates a certain visual confusion about who is actually in the room. She adjusted her bracelet, heavy gold, the kind you do not adjust because it needs adjusting, and moved on. One of the two colleagues laughed. The other looked at her phone. Bisi stood where she was, beside the pillar, and finished her tonic water. She set the glass down on a passing tray. She went back to the third floor and opened the file she had left on her desk, because there was a transport reimbursement discrepancy she had been tracking for 3 weeks, and it was not going to resolve itself. She found it that same evening at 6:45, when most of the floor had already emptied. A recurring entry in the transport reimbursement accounts, vendor code TR0047, a different invoice number each time, appearing twice per month, each entry below the single invoice review threshold. Together, they added up to 340,000 naira per month, running for 7 months. Total 2,380,000 naira, flowing to a vendor whose registration number did not match the company's approved vendor database. It was a billing error, or it was something that had been structured to look like one. She prepared the finding in a 3-page internal note, attached the 12 relevant invoice scans, and placed it in Mr. E's tray at 7:15 the next morning. He submitted it to Group Finance with a cover note the same afternoon. The payment trail was investigated. The contractor was found to have submitted duplicate invoices through an administrative oversight in their billing system. Genuine error, poorly monitored. Correction was approved. The contractor was placed on a compliance notice, and the vendor entry was flagged for quarterly review. 3 days after the correction was approved, Kemi passed her in the lobby on a Wednesday morning, paused mid-stride, and said, I hope you understand that the role of internal audit is to support the decisions management has already made, not to perform what I imagine you think is detective work. You are not here because you are brilliant, Bisi. You are here because his mother felt sorry for a village corper, and his people do not know how to say no to family sentiment. Please do not confuse your origin story with your qualifications. The lobby was occupied at that moment by the security guard at reception, one cleaning staff with a bucket, and a junior marketing officer who developed an urgent interest in her handbag zipper. Bisi stood still in the center of the lobby for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went to the third floor and opened the next file. The problem was not Bisi's finding. The problem was what the finding made possible. What was happening on the sixth floor during those same weeks was this. Kemi Adeyemi had a financial situation that had been deteriorating since the previous year. 18 months earlier, she had diverted 38,700,000 naira from OPG's operating funds into a subsidiary account recorded internally as an advance payment to a property development firm in Abuja, Crestfall Realty Partners, for a commercial development project she had co-invested in privately. The memo authorizing the transaction carried her own signature as Group Finance Director and a second authorization from a former audit manager who had since resigned. The property deal had collapsed in March of the current year when the project's lead contractor declared insolvency. Crestfall Realty returned 21 million naira, citing force majeure provisions in the development agreement. The remaining 17,700,000 naira had dissolved into the failed project. Kemi had been managing the gap for 3 quarters. She rerouted reconciliations through multiple cost lines across 3 budget periods, kept the amounts below individual review thresholds, and trusted that the annual audit would not isolate the pattern from the noise of normal operating variance. The annual audit was now 11 weeks away, and the junior analyst on the third floor had just demonstrated via a 2 million naira transport discrepancy that she read financial records the way a surgeon reads an x-ray, carefully, systematically, and without interest in what the patient would prefer she not find. Kemi was not going to wait 11 weeks. She had been watching Bisi's since the transport reconciliation finding in October, the way you watch a small fire that has appeared in a place where fires are not supposed to be, calculating whether it will go out on its own. It had not gone out. It had, in fact, grown quietly, without announcement, in the manner of things that are sustained by oxygen rather than accelerant. And in November, Kemi had heard from a group finance colleague that the junior analyst on the third floor had begun pulling the accounts for the prior fiscal year's midstream distribution costs, which was routine for the annual audit cycle, but was not, in Kemi's experience, something a junior analyst did thoroughly without a reason. She spent 3 evenings reviewing what Biggies would find if she looked long enough and closely enough. She knew the answer before she finished. The advance to Crestfall Realty was documented as a payment, not a loan, which meant its absence from the recovery line was an irregularity that would surface the moment someone questioned why a 38 million naira operating advance had no corresponding return entry in the current year's receivables. A junior analyst who noticed a 2 million naira transport discrepancy would notice this. The question was when, not whether. The plan she settled on was not complicated. Its simplicity was, in fact, its most dangerous feature, not elaborate enough to leave many tracks, not requiring assistance from anyone who could later become a liability. She needed a document. She needed a second signature that was not hers. She needed speed because the value of the plan depended entirely on the transfer clearing before anyone reviewed the authorization, and she had the access to ensure that speed. She had been collecting reference materials for Bisi's signature without acknowledging to herself that she was doing so. She told herself she was keeping records. The transport reconciliation note had been copied to group finance 3 weeks earlier and sat in her filing cabinet in a folder labeled Audit Correspondence, Q3. The signature at the bottom of the note was clear, confident, and entirely legible. She examined it on the evening of the 12th under her desk lamp for approximately 6 minutes and decided she could produce something close enough. The forensic risk, she calculated, was minimal. In practice, forged document examinations were requested only when the forgery was already suspected, and she did not intend for it to be suspected. She intended for it to be assumed. She prepared the document on a Thursday evening, the 14th of September. It was a payment authorization memo addressed to Crestline Merchant Bank, Port Harcourt, requesting the transfer of 38,700,000 naira from OPG's primary operations account, a repayment of a sum she intended to back date as a loan recovery from the prior period's advance. The memo carried the standard dual authorization block, a format OPG's Financial Controls Manual had introduced 3 years earlier precisely to prevent any single director from authorizing large transactions unilaterally. One authorization block was for the group finance director. The second was for the internal audit department's signatory. Required because of the transaction size, which exceeded the 20 million naira threshold for independent audit endorsement. In the internal audit authorization block, Kemi signed the name Bisi Adelek. She had practiced the signature from a document Bisi had submitted 4 weeks earlier. The transport reconciliation finding note, which bore Bisi's handwritten sign-off in the bottom right corner. The practice had taken her 11 minutes. The final signature on the memo took 4. She printed the document at 11:47 p.m. in the 6th-floor print room in a building that was otherwise occupied by 2 security guards on the ground floor and a cleaning crew working their way up from the basement. The memo was submitted to the bank the following morning before 9 o'clock. The transfer cleared at 2:14 p.m. on the 15th of September. At 11:47 p.m. on Thursday, the 14th of September, Bisi Adeleke was in a classroom at Rumuola Community Secondary School, 63 minutes from OPG's head office by Keke Napep, teaching a preparatory lesson for 12 adult students enrolled in the school's evening WAEC remediation program. She had seen a flyer for the program at her church 3 weeks after arriving in Port Harcourt and had offered to volunteer her Thursday evenings. The classroom had a CCTV camera mounted above the door frame installed by the school's board the year before. The attendance register carried 12 names and 12 signatures. The school principal had issued Bisi a volunteer identity card with a dated entry log. None of this was visible to the 12 people who sat around the boardroom table the following Wednesday morning, looking at a memo with her name on it. The meeting had been called by Mr. Ease after Group Finance submitted the payment memo to the board secretary, noting that the 38,700,000 naira transfer had cleared within hours of the document being signed, and that the internal audit signatory had not filed any corresponding audit note or review record, which, for a transaction of this size, was not only irregular, but a direct violation of the department's own procedures. The board secretary had flagged it to two directors the previous evening. The meeting was called the next morning. Bisi was given no description of the meeting before she entered the room. She was shown the memo. She read it completely. Her signature looked like hers, the way a shadow looks like a person, the right general shape, the wrong specifics. The lowercase e in Adlek had a closed loop at the exit stroke. Hers had never closed. Her fourth grade teacher had spent 2 full terms trying to correct it without success, and somewhere in that unsuccessful effort, the open exit stroke had become as fixed as her fingerprints. She pointed this out in the first 15 seconds in a voice that did not waver. She said, "The letter E in my surname in this signature is closed. My E is always open. I have signed my name approximately 40,000 times in my life, and it has never closed. I will stand here for as long as you need, but that signature is not mine." The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone has said something specific that cannot be immediately contradicted. One director asked her where she had been on Thursday evening. She told him Rumuola Community Secondary School, voluntary WAEC instruction, 12 students, attendance register, security camera above the classroom door from 7 p.m. to 9:15 p.m. Easy, beside her, wrote down the school's name on his notepad. Namdi sat at the head of the table and said nothing for 4 minutes. He was looking at the memo, or at the table, or at something between them. He was the kind of man who was at his most dangerous when he was that quiet, because the quietness was not uncertainty. It was the space he needed to make a decision that would hold. Then he said, "We will pause this meeting pending a formal internal investigation. BC, you are placed on administrative suspension with full pay, effective today. Please surrender your access card to Mr. Ease." She placed it on the table. She walked through the lobby that was suddenly smaller than she remembered, past the security guard who had scanned her badge 53 times, out into the heat of Trans Amadi Road, into a Kek Ne Pep that she had to flag twice before it stopped. She paid 250 naira and sat in the small vehicle looking at the road ahead. She was back at her flat in Gere Phase 2 by 10:30. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on for a long time. The envelope, labeled "Mistakes," was in the small drawer beside the bed. She had not expected to need it for this. She called her mother in Lagos. She did not explain the full situation. She was not sure she had the energy to do so accurately, and inaccurate explanations are worse than silence. She said work was complicated. Her mother said God is in control and asked if she was eating enough. Bisi said yes, which was almost true. After the call, she sat with the signature in her memory, specifically the letter E and its closed loop, until she was absolutely certain she was right. She was right. But being right and being believed are two different rooms, and at this moment she was standing in the corridor between them with no key. The 8 days of suspension were not idle days, even though they looked like it from the outside. She could not work. She could not enter the building. She could not access the files she would have needed to build her own defense, which was the particular cruelty of suspension as a procedural mechanism. It removes you from the one environment in which you might be able to demonstrate your innocence. She spent the first 2 days reviewing, from memory, every transaction record she had personally reviewed in the past 2 months, tracing back through her recollection of the department's files to identify anything that should not be there. She wrote notes in the small notebook she kept in her desk drawer at home, the one she used for personal accounting. She filled 4 pages. On the third day, she went to Rumuola Community Secondary School and asked the principal, Mrs. Adaora Igwe, to print a copy of the attendance register from the evening class on September the 14th. Mrs. Igwe did so without asking for an explanation, which was itself a small act of decency that Bisi would not forget. The register was 3 pages, 12 names, 12 signatures. The date stamp at the top was automatic. The school's system generated it when the register was created, and the creation timestamp read 6:59 p.m., consistent with the class that started at 7. She put the pages in an envelope and kept it in her bag. Then she went home and made rice with corned beef for dinner because it was the fastest thing she had, and her mind was too occupied to give cooking the attention it required. She ate at the table with the envelope beside her plate and thought about the letter E and its open exit stroke, and the fact that 37 years of writing her own name meant that some things could not be forged thoroughly enough to survive examination. She had to trust that fact. At the moment, it was most of what she had. Mama Chinwe called on a Thursday, 8 days after the suspension. Bisi had not told her. She did not know how the old woman had heard, because the suspension had not been announced publicly, and Nanamdi was not the type to bring company affairs into his mother's sitting room. But Mama Chinwe lived among people who noticed things, and in a tight community, silence from a direction that had been speaking regularly is its own kind of message. "My daughter," she said when Bisi picked up. "What is happening?" "There is a problem at work, Mama." "What kind of problem?" "Someone signed my name to a document. I did not sign it." The line was quiet for 5 seconds, long enough to hear the compound sounds behind Mama Chinwe's voice, a generator somewhere, a dog at the far end of the road, the particular quality of evening air in Umuchukwu. Then Mama Chinwe said in English, "What time did this paper say it was signed?" 11:47 in the evening, on a Thursday. Hen. A pause. "The Thursday you were at that school, the evening class." "Yes, Mama." "My daughter, do not move. Stay where you are. I am making one call." She did not ask who Mama Chinwe was calling. She had learned, over 8 months of Tuesday and Saturday evenings, that the old woman's capacity for action operated in channels that were not visible until they were needed, the way underground water is not visible until someone digs in the right place. Mama Chinwe called the Okafor family's legal counsel, Mrs. Uzo Obiora of Obiora and Associates, Port Harcourt, who had managed the family's legal affairs for 11 years, and who received the call from Mama Chinwe on a Thursday afternoon while reviewing a maritime contract on the other side of her desk. Mrs. Obiora had not been informed about the investigation, which was itself, she would note later, a procedural irregularity that told her something about the speed at which events had moved. She was briefed in 20 minutes. She was at OPG's head office the following morning with a formal letter requesting that the board commission an independent forensic examination of the queried document before drawing any conclusion, citing Section 35(1) of the Nigerian Evidence Act and 3 precedents from company fraud proceedings in Rivers State. She delivered the letter in person to the board secretary. She was 6 feet tall in her court shoes and wore a charcoal gray suit that carried the quiet authority of a closing argument. The board agreed to commission an independent examiner. This was partly because of the letter. It was also partly because three directors had been uncomfortable about the memo from the beginning, specifically about the speed of the subsequent bank transfer, which had cleared before any department head had been notified, which was the kind of operational efficiency that gave careful people pause. The examiner engaged was Dr. Raymond Egwatu of the Forensic Science Unit at the University of Lagos, a document examiner with 19 years of casework who had testified in 14 fraud proceedings and whose findings had not been successfully challenged in any of them. He came with a portable examination kit, two loop lenses of different magnification, and an ultraviolet light source. He also came with the particular calm of a man who has looked at enough lies on paper to have stopped finding them surprising. He set up on the second floor in a room with controlled lighting. He worked for 3 hours. He examined the queried signature against 11 authenticated reference specimens drawn from documents bearing Bisi's handwritten sign-off across her 2 months at OPG. The transport reconciliation note, two quarterly report cover sheets, four file transmission records, and four procedural acknowledgement forms. He photographed everything. He made measurements. He placed the documents side by side under the loupe and moved between them with a patience that had nothing theatrical about it. His written report ran to 6 pages. The summary was 2 paragraphs, and it was exact. The signature on the payment authorization memo, dated September 14th, did not match the reference specimens. The primary inconsistency, consistent across all 11 authenticated specimens, absent from the queried signature, was in the formation of the lowercase letter e. In the authenticated documents, this character was written with a consistently open exit stroke at the terminal end of the letter form, whereas the queried signature presented a closed loop at the identical point, a formation habit distinct from and inconsistent with the subject's established writing pattern. Secondary inconsistencies included elevated pen pressure on the stem of the letter K in Adelaide and a baseline drift of 3 millimeters on the terminal letter E, a rising drift not present in any of the 11 reference specimens. Conclusion: the signature on the payment authorization memo of September 14th was not produced by Bisi Adeleke. The board called an emergency session the evening before OPG's annual pipeline expansion inauguration ceremony. Namdi was at the table. Mrs. Obiora was at the table. Mr. Ease was at the table. Kemi Adeyemi was at the table, seated with the posture and composure of someone who has not yet understood that the room has changed since she last sat in it. The report placed on the table. Namdi read it. He read it a second time. Then he set it face down, not dismissively, but with the care of someone placing something in a position where it will not be moved again, and looked at Kemi. His face had the quality of something that has been decided. Not angry, decided. Mrs. Obiora asked Kemi to describe in her own words the process by which the memo had been prepared. She asked about the 14th of September specifically. She asked about the Abuja property advance from 18 months prior. She asked about the gap between the 38,700,000 naira disbursed and the 21 million returned. Kemi's composure lasted 11 minutes. It is difficult to maintain the architecture of a lie in a room that contains, on the table in front of you, a 6-page scientific document detailing its specific structural failures. The composure did not collapse all at once. It went in stages. First, a version in which the signature block had been processed within her understood authority. Then a longer version involving a miscommunication about the dual authorization protocol. Then a silence that went on long enough to become its own kind of statement. And then, because she was intelligent enough to calculate the difference between what she could still manage and what she could not, a partial account. The Abuja investment, the collapse of the project, the 17,700,000 naira that had not been recovered, the 3/4 of managed reconciliations, The memo she had prepared on the evening of the 14th. She did not say the word forgery, but she described, in enough specificity, the reference document she had used, the print room, the time, that the word arrived in the room without needing to be spoken by her. Namdi asked her to leave the building. She stood. She picked up her phone from the table. She walked to the door. In the doorway, she paused. And for a moment, it seemed she would say something, perhaps to Nanamdi, perhaps to the table in general. She did not. The door closed. The room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration. Then one of the directors said quietly that they should inform Bisi of the findings. Namdi was already reaching for his phone. He came to her flat that night, alone, no convoy. He rang the compound gate at 9:45 and waited in the small courtyard under the bulb strung from the awning while the gateman went to knock on her door. She came out wearing house clothes, a plain shirt, a cotton wrapper, and stood in the courtyard and listened to him speak. He told her the examiner's findings. He told her what Kemi had admitted. He told her the suspension was lifted effective immediately. Her access card would be reactivated by 7 the next morning, and that the decision to suspend her had been made faster than the situation warranted, and he was aware of that. Then he said, "I should have asked where you were on that Thursday before I asked for your access card." Bisi looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He nodded. He had nothing to add to that, and he did not try to. What happened the following morning was witnessed by 114 people, 2 television news crews from Port Harcourt-based stations, a row of upstream business partners who had flown in from Abuja for the event, tumults, and approximately 11 journalists who were there to cover the commissioning of a 47-kilometer pipeline and found themselves reporting on something more durable. OPG's annual pipeline expansion inauguration ceremony was held at the company's logistics compound in Onne. White tents had been erected in the yard, row upon row of chairs arranged for the partners. Government liaison representatives, community leaders from the 26 villages along the pipeline corridor, and company staff from all departments. The catering was local. 4 women from Ane Town who had been doing this event for 3 consecutive years, and whose pepper soup was the first thing people mentioned when describing the ceremony afterward. Kemi Adeyemi was not there. Her name had been removed from the guest list at 6 o'clock that morning. 30 minutes after the event started, the reason for her absence was beginning to circulate in the seated rows with the quiet efficiency of true information, who had been suspended, Pakinjit, who had been cleared, what the forensic report said, what had been admitted in the emergency session the night before. It moved the way facts move when they have the advantage of being specific. In full sentences, not rumor fragments. Namdi rose to speak at 10:32. The tent was full. He stood at the lectern with the kind of stillness that means something entirely different from passivity. The stillness of a man who has processed the night before and come out the other side with a clearer understanding of what he is building. He spoke about the 47-kilometer pipeline being commissioned that morning. He spoke about the 18 months of construction, the engineering teams, the community liaison process that had required individual land access agreements with representatives of every village along the route. He spoke about what it means to build infrastructure that a region will depend on for decades. That the engineering has to be right, but the foundation has to be right first. He said that OPG would be implementing a new financial authorization protocol, effective January the 1st of the following year. The dual authentication and verification standard, requiring any transaction above 5 million naira to carry independently verified digital signatures from 2 separate departments. Confirmed through a centralized authentication log accessible to the board's audit committee in real time. He said the protocol had been developed in response to a failure in the company's current controls. and that the internal audit department had been instrumental in exposing that failure. He did not say Bisi's name. He did not need to. 30 of the 114 people in that tent already knew it, and the other 84 would know it by the time the pepper soup was being served. In the lobby afterward, as the event moved to the pipeline corridor for the ceremonial valve commissioning, one of the Abuja partners, a man who had been in petroleum contracting for 22 years and had seen his share of company crises, stopped at the internal audit table where Mr. Ease and Bisi were seated. He was big man, heavyset, with the manner of someone who had spent 2 decades treating small talk as an optional expense. He looked at Bisi. "I heard about the document examination," he said. "Good for you for not accepting something that was not yours to accept." It was a small thing to say. It was also the precise thing. At the pipeline commissioning an hour later, Bisi stood near the back of the gathered crowd with Mr. Ease and 2 other analysts. The valve turned. The ceremony was brief and technical and entirely unglamorous, which is what engineering achievements usually are when they are real. She watched the officials and the cameras and the river of people with press badges, and she thought about a kerosene vendor in a market in Umuchukwu and a woman who had held a damaged photograph as carefully as a fallen bird. She thought everything started there. Kemi Adeyemi's separation from Okonkwo Petroleum Group was completed on the 23rd of October. Formal termination, documentation of cause, full exit process. A petition was submitted to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the EFCC, Nigeria's principal anti-corruption and financial fraud enforcement body, citing the fraudulent diversion of company funds and the preparation and use of a falsified financial instrument. The investigation was opened and remained ongoing. Legal processes move at the pace of institutions, which is slower than most people want and faster than many expect. What happened at OPG was not slow. Within 6 weeks of the inauguration ceremony, Namdi had separated the finance and audit reporting lines so that they no longer shared a command chain beneath a single director. He engaged an independent accounting firm to conduct a retrospective review of 2 full years of OPG's accounts. Not because the board had required it, but because a close call has its own kind of education, and he was not going to pass up the lesson. The review found 2 additional instances of vendor billing irregularities that had gone unnoticed, totaling approximately 4,100,000 naira. Both were administrative errors. Both were corrected and their conditions restructured. The 17,700,000 naira that Kemi had been unable to recover from the Abuja property deal was recorded as a loss on the company's books. It was absorbed. The entry was named in the audit file and explained without ambiguity. The gap hurt less than the condition that had made it possible, and the condition was being addressed. Mr. Ize brought Bisi a copy of the new financial controls framework the morning it was finalized. He placed it on her desk, tapped the cover twice, and said, "The dual authentication protocol has been documented internally as the Adelic control standard. I am telling you before you encounter it somewhere else." He walked back into his office and closed the door. Bisi read the document once, then again, then she put it in her desk drawer and sat for a while in the particular quality of silence that follows the end of something that has cost more than you plan to spend. The thing about restorative justice, the real kind, not the version that appears in speeches, is that it rarely looks the way people imagine when they are on the wrong side of a false accusation. They imagine a dramatic reversal, a public declaration, a moment when everyone who doubted them has to look at them directly and say the words. What actually happens is quieter and stranger. A document protocol is named after you. A director who said nothing when Kemi insulted you in a lobby now holds doors open when he sees you and calls you the analyst instead of the young lady. Small recalibrations. The world not reversing its error, but adjusting its weight distribution. Namdi changed more visibly than any of them. He had always been a man who ran on precision and control, and he had made a decision in a boardroom that had failed both. Quick, influenced by optics rather than evidence, framed by the position of the person making the accusation rather than the quality of what was accused. He had lived with that error. Through the suspension, through the investigation, through the night, he stood in her compound yard and said the sentences he needed to say. He was not a man who forgave himself quickly for getting important things wrong, and Bisi suspected, watching him in the weeks that followed, that he was still working on it. He worked on it by being thorough. Every significant decision that came through his desk in the 3 months after the inauguration was reviewed, with a delay he had not previously allowed. A pause, a second opinion sought even when he was confident, a habit of asking what he might be assuming rather than seeing. Bisi noticed this in the way she noticed most things, not loudly, but accurately. She mentioned it to him once in passing on an evening when they had gone for supper at a restaurant on Grey where the pepper soup was better than it had any right to be. He said, "My father used to grade his students' work twice. Once the night it was submitted, once again the following morning. He said the first reading told you what was there. The second reading told you what you had assumed was there." "He sounds like he was a very good teacher," Bisi said. "He was," Nanamdi said. "He was a very good teacher." He looked at his soup. The restaurant was neither loud nor quiet. The middle register of a Port Harcourt evening. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and neither of them filled the moment with anything, because they had both developed, somewhere across the year, a comfort with silence that did not require explanation. Mama Chinwe called that Sunday. She asked whether Port Harcourt had treated Bisi well enough that she intended to stay. Bisi said she was staying. Mama Chinwe said hin, in the tone of someone who had already known the answer and was confirming it for the record. It was in November that Mama Chinwe asked for her help with something she had been preparing since August. The annual observance of Emmanuel's death anniversary. The 9th anniversary fell on a Sunday in February. In Mama Chinwe's tradition, the day involved a gathering of close family and community, a shared meal, a prayer, and the laying of flowers at the place where Emmanuel had been sitting when he died. For 3 years, she had managed it alone or with neighbors. This year, she wanted it done as it should be done. Not as a performance, but as the kind of remembrance that a person's life deserves. "I want someone who understands what a thing like this means," she said. "Someone who knows that the point of remembering is not to present an occasion, but to be genuinely present in it." Bisi drove from Port Harcourt to Umuchukwu on the Saturday before. She helped Mama Chinwe cook the things Emmanuel had loved: of onugbu with stockfish, white rice, a bowl of ukwa soaked and steamed from dried breadfruit seed, the way his mother had made it for him as a child. She helped set up the chairs outside the compound doorway, Emmanuel's chair on the left, exactly where it always stood. She arranged the flowers herself: dried xora from the compound garden, yellow hibiscus cut fresh from the bush along the road beside the school, gathered in a low clay pot that had belonged to the compound for longer than anyone could say. Nanamdi arrived from Port Harcourt on Sunday morning. He drove alone. He stood in the doorway of the compound and looked at the chairs, at the flowers, at the pot still radiating warmth from the kitchen, at Bisi folding a wrapper at the table in the sitting room. He stood there for a long moment before he said anything. The observance was quiet. Mama Chinwe led the prayer in Igbo. Nanamdi translated in a low voice for Bisi when she leaned toward him. After the meal, they sat in the compound in the cooling afternoon. 3 people, 2 chairs, and a bench. Emmanuel's presence held between them in the smell of egusias and the sound of the compound settling into evening. When Bisi stood to leave, Nanamdi walked her to the main road. The moon was already out, thin and white against a sky that had not yet committed to dark. He said, "My father would have liked you. He respected people who were precise without being cold." He thought those two things had nothing to do with each other. Bisi said, "Your mother told me he graded papers before sunrise every morning for 31 years, without fail, even on the mornings after arguments, even when he was sick." He paused. "I used to think it was stubbornness. Now I think it was just knowing what the work was for." There was a pause that was not silence, but something occupying the space of it. Then he said, looking at the road and not at her, "I want to keep talking to you outside of work, outside of everything that has happened this year. Is that something you want?" She looked at the road, at the moon, at the man beside her who had once sat at the head of a table and found a scratch in the wood grain more manageable to look at than her face, and who had come tonight alone without a convoy to stand in his father's compound and listen to his mother pray. "Yes," she said, "that is something I want." They were married the following December, on a Saturday, in a ceremony held in Emmanuel's compound in Umuchukwu. Not at a hotel, not in a hall in Port Harcourt, not in any venue with air conditioning and a DJ who played before the speeches were finished. Mama Chinwe had asked for the compound. The compound was what they used. It was rented chairs under string lights, two borrowed tables long enough for all the food, a caterer from the village who had known the Okafor family for 30 years, and a group of women from the Ajo Cooperative who arrived in matching green wrappers because they had agreed to do so among themselves without telling anyone. 23 women, the full group, every one of them present. Bisi walked into the ceremony in a cream-lace dress sewn by a tailor on Balagan Street in Lagos across 3 fittings, each one requiring a specific adjustment, the final version landing within 4 millimeters of what she had imagined when she first described it. No borrowed blouse, no CV in her hands. Mama Chinwe sat in Emmanuel's chair and watched her walk in. She held the repaired photograph of Emmanuel in her lap. The frame had been restored by a craftsman in Onitsha who had matched the wood grain exactly. She did not look away from Bisi until the ceremony was done. "There are a few things this story is built on that are real, and I want to name them before you go, because they will serve you longer than the story itself. The Ajo Savings Cooperative that Bisi ran. 23 women, 5,000 naira monthly, no bank, no form, just a ledger, and the kind of trust that exists between neighbors is not invented for the purpose of this story. It is one of the oldest and most effective community financial tools in West Africa. Yoruba communities call it Ajo. Igbo communities have their own variation. Hausa communities have Adashe. Other traditions across the continent use different names for the same underlying mechanism. Rotating savings and credit associations in which a group of people contribute fixed amounts at regular intervals and each member receives the full pool in. Development economists have studied these arrangements for decades, and what the research consistently shows is that they function not because of formal governance structures, but because of social accountability. People contribute reliably because the person they owe is someone whose face they see every week. If you live in a community where formal banking is inaccessible, expensive, or unreliable, and you are considering starting or joining a rotating savings group, the Central Bank of Nigeria's Financial Inclusion Resources at CBN, Gov, Eng, include guidance on cooperative structures, registration processes, and how to formalize a savings group without losing the informal trust that makes it work. You do not need a lawyer to start. You need a group, a ledger, and a reliable person to keep it honest. The second thing I want to name is document forgery and how it is identified. The forensic examination in this story, the examiner looking at pen pressure, the loop in a single letter, the baseline drift of 3 millimeters, reflects the actual methodology of forensic handwriting analysis, which is a legitimate forensic discipline. Signatures have writing habits that are formed over years and remain consistent across time and context. Trained examiners compare queried signatures to authenticated reference specimens and identify deviations in those habits. It is painstaking work, and it can be wrong, which is why courts require qualified examiners and multiple reference samples. But it is real work, not guesswork. If you believe a document bearing your name has been falsified, a contract, an authorization, a legal instrument, the first step is to preserve authenticated examples of your genuine signature from various documents across different time periods. The second is to insist, before any conclusion is drawn, on an independent examination by a qualified examiner. In Nigeria, reports of suspected document fraud or crimes can be submitted directly to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission at EFCC.gov.ng or through their public complaints channels. I am not a lawyer, and nothing in this story constitutes legal or financial advice. I am someone who wanted to tell a story about what happens when careful work, done consistently and without an audience, eventually speaks louder than a lie that was loud from the beginning. Bisi did not survive that boardroom because she was fortunate or because the right people happened to intervene. She survived it because she had been doing her work correctly from the very first morning she sat at that third floor desk. And correct work, over time, leaves a record that cannot be forged. That is all integrity is, in the end. Not a feeling, not a declaration, a record. If this story moved you, leave your city in the comments below and tell me which part stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this one. And thank you for staying until the end.